The Marriage That Was Made in Heaven by J. Marshall Mather. When I first saw her, she would be about 75 years old, but in no way decrepit with the wear and tear of time. The winters had dealt kindly with her, for her hair was scarce frosted, and each summer had left its glow upon her ruddy cheek. There was an erectness in her walk that seemed to scorn the hand of the avenger, and her kindliness of tone gave proof that the proverbial crabbed element had not disenchanted the glory of her age. Whenever we met, a greeting was upon her lips, accompanied by some religious ejaculation, for she was a Methodist of the Methodists, a saintess among the saintly, at least so it was said. Nor did I ever meet with, or hear, of any word or act of hers that contravened her reputation. She was the critic of the sanctuary, the leader in what was termed the means of grace. More than once she had declaimed, or proclaimed, shall I say, on the village green, and she was often sent for to the bedsides of the dying. She was the product of what old Harry called nature and grace, and the old man was not far wrong in his estimate. There was, as he put it, a boon a bit of both. But as I once heard Rachel say to him, when he was telling her of this contradiction in her nature, "Thou knows, lad, where sin abounds, grace doth much more abound," climaxing her retort by telling him that he was past grace, and leaving him the worse for conflict in this war of words. The air of the village was rife with stories told as to her quaintness, and the prodigies wrought by her prayers of faith, while many of her sayings were current coin. She was often spoken of as a wrostler with thou lad, or in other words, with the devil. She had been known to pray 2 hours at a stretch in the days of the great revival, many of the congregation in the meanwhile retiring for their tea, and returning for the evening service to find her still agate. It was told how, once when a youth came to preach at the chapel, from what the masters called the theological seminary, that she cried out in her prayer, "Save us, Lord, fra preachers from the theological cemeteries, if they're all as deed as Jap thou sent today," while on another occasion, during the profound discourse of an erudite M.A., somniferous in its effects upon the congregation, the plain walls of the barn-like Zion echoed the cry, "That's sewing with 2 fine needles, lad." These had not always been Rachel's moods. In her earlier years, the mirth and indifference of an irreligious life, to use her own words, had been hers. She could tell of feasts and fairs and junketings, of summer Sabbath afternoons spent in nutting in the cloughs, and of rambles on the moors, of trips to the city over the hills, in those days a world wonder to the operatives in the rapidly developing manufacture of the county. But as she once said to me in one of her talks of the past, "The things that were gained to me I counted loss for Christ." Then, as if the memory of those days was not altogether without its sweets, she continued, "But them were grand old times, them were." One day I determined to ask old Harry to give me the history of this remarkable woman, and so quaintly did he tell it, and so realistically too, that it would mar the story if I were to give it any other fashion save his own. "I've known 3 Rachels," he said, "Rachel as the lass, and a wicken who were, and all. Rachel converted, and Rachel wed. I welly think as the first Rachel were best. Not as I've a word to say again conversion, though I never tried it myself, but I know plenty as has, some folk better, and some folk were. I know and believe in a religion that draws a fellow's face like the tooth art that comes gnawing from a bone, not as how Rachel's one of that sort, who can still laugh and crack her joke wi' ony ours, but who's known as bright as who were afore who geet convarted. Dear, who were the merriest lass in the village, up to all sorts of marks, and we'n as wick as owd nicks, with no one know his malice in it, and a lip ready for anybody. I can remember when who were waving in the shed yonder, how who used to keep 'em all in a roar. There wasn't a single felly in village who couldn't have wed, but like as who thought herself a moon porridge, and who kept 'em all out at gate. Not as who always did fair by 'em, for who had a way of leading 'em on and then making fools of 'em, and who kept on doing this until lads fought shy on her and left her to herself. But who were as well favoured as who were faulty, and for the most part folk used to forgive and forget. If ever I seed a regular witch, a Lancashire witch I mean, it were Rachel, in days when who were young. But like as religion took summat steam out of her, leastways, it did to my fancy. Yea, like as after who were converted, who took things more serious, and began to talk a deal about death and judgment and fleeing from wrath to come. Who stopped off wi' her old companions, or else they stopped it off wi' her, because who were always asking 'em about their souls. Who get plaguey religious, and folk willn't have it. They like to go their own gate. On a road you cannot drive 'em through the straight gate, as they call it. If they don't go through by themselves, they won't go through at all. After the old man had finished his somewhat philosophic deliverance, he paused and then continued. Have you ever noticed how religion turns a chap right round till he puts his back on his old mates and turns his face towards new uns? They call it a new nature up at chapel yon, and it is with some on 'em, and no mistake. I'm content with what I am, not but what I might be better, but I might swap work, so I'm content to remain as I am. I had heard many dissertations on conversion, but never one as quaint and as original as this one, which fell from old Harry's lips. Nor was he altogether mistaken, for the gloom of faith is almost as fearful to contemplate as the frivolity of thoughtless youth. Dogma is a terrible force in retarding the development of that otherwise spontaneous life which is truly nature's gift, and which it is nature's purpose to perfect. Here was a rude, unlettered man, who had seen in others that sudden transit from gaiety to gloom, leading him to shrink from the so-called faith which was its factor. When Rachel got converted, who spent all the spare time up at chapel, where who was singing and praying as though I'd been an angel. Then who took to throwing off her bits of finery, who pooed the feather out of her hat and took the droppers out of her ears and began all dressing in black, as though we were bound to a burying, who took to macking a deal at parsons, and who'd fotch the tea for 'em to vestry, and then who took to supping tea with 'em herself, and joining with 'em in prayer. There were a young local preacher as used to come up moors from Dandyshaw, and they used to say as how he and Rachel did a deal of praying together by themselves in vestry. Then he'd walk with him a bit on way home at night, when the preaching were o'er, and then it began to be whispered that they'd getting engaged. And if Rachel could have had her own way, there would have been an all, but then who couldn't? And as the young fellow had recommended for ministry and was sent to college, he come no more that road, and ended up be marrying a lass whose feyther run a mill of his own. Then it were Rachel began talking about the vanities and pomps of this wicked world, and telling, in what they call her experience, what a vain thing it were to put one's confidence in man. And when the leader of the class who met him would say, Sister Rachel, give out a verse, who used to give out, Let me cast my reeds aside, all that feeds my knowing pride, not to man, but God submit, lay my reasonings at thy feet. And when who come to third line, not to man, but God submit, who used to bring a clog down on vestry floor and bang a knave, that is a fist, on the table and shout out, "No, Lord, not to man, never, not to man, but God submit." There were them as wondered how it were who always gave out this verse, and then there were them as thought they knew. The truth were, the lass had been crossed in love, and set all men down as deceivers. Who welly persuaded herself as who'd had naught more to do with fellies. Nay, I believe as who made up her mind who'd never wed. Not but what who'd the chance, but them as come when on at reach saw, for a bit that thou bride were left, though who were converted, but who kept on shaking her head and saying no, till they gae o' coming and asking, and as the years went on, who settled down into a reg'lar old maid, who used to call herself the Lord's spouse, whatever who might mean by that, and who were very fond of raising her finger and pointing to chapel ceiling, and saying something about her house and portion being a boon. But thou lass had a cottage of her own, and knew how to tak care on it and all, and who'd a stocking full of brass, as who'd saved from her earnings. One day, when who were talking to superintender, he asked her how it were as who'd never wed. "I'm wedded to the Lord," who said. "Well, I knows," said Thelmon, "the Lord's knowing about sharing thy love with a decent husband if thou can find one, for as he's towed us in book, it's noan good for man to be alone, nor woman neither." "Mr. Jones," says Rachel, "a mon's naught in my line. I've done wi' 'em long sin. They've vain things for safety, and the fear of mon bringeth a snare. I'm with the poet when he says, not to man but God submit, lay my reasonings at thy feet." "Thou'll happen live to change thy mind, Rachel," said the old felly. "I've seen how the ones near you caught afore today." "You'll never see me caught," said Rachel. "Leastways, if thou does, thou shall wed me." But it turned out thou superintender knew more nor who did, as you'll hear. "You were never at the charity sermons, were you?" asked old Harry. "No," I said. "I've heard much of them. Why?" "Well, charity sermons is the day when old lasses look their best, when the plain uns look bonny, and thousands look young. The chapel's fair, like a garden of posies, for there's flowers in their hats and roses in their faces, and as mony colours in their dresses as there is in the bow in the clouds. Even Rachel used to don herself up a bit at the charity, and as religion hadn't marred her, past looking at, who come out blooming that day for all who were 50 year old and turned. I saw as who walked up to chapel in th' afternoon, and I thought to myself, that's straight and shapely as when thou were a lass. It's a greatly shame thou should be an old maid. And I began to think at thou days when who could crack her jokes and poo all young fellies in village at her tale. 30 years ago, I says to myself, by Guy, what changes sin then? Well, that afternoon they were going in for a big collection, and they give the plates to all them as were likely to give gowd. One of these was out Gideon at Tops, a grass farmer as lived about 4 miles away, an old Methody, and a bachelor and all. It fell out as he'd to tap the plate to Rachel, and when who put her half-sovereign on, who looked up in his e'en, and them as were near said as who blushed. Dear, they were thowed e'en, though who had been converted 30 years, and when they opened their fire on Gideon, he let the plate drop. Then like as they both had to stoop to pick up the brass, and thou chap's spectacles somehow or other get fastened in Rachel's bonnet, and when they pooed their heads apart, their faces were as red as the poppies as nodded in childers' hats. There were them as said he put question when their heads were down in pew bottom, but I don't believe that. On he rode. It were the bringing on 'em together, and it were the beginning at th' end, for at the next lettings Gideon took a sitting and started walking all the moors to Rachel's Zion and worshipping there. There's money ways of doing a bit of courting, but when folks is getting old, and when they both can bide, like as it's different with what it is with most when they know what lads and lasses. On he rode. It were with Gideon and Rachel. Why, what do you know about it, Harry? I inquired of the old man. Naught but what I've heard. Rachel telled it herself at the love feast, and them at her telled me after. Well, what was the story? Can you remember? It was somewhat like this, said Harry. One Sunday night, when the prayer meeting were o'er, where Rachel had given out her favourite verse, not to man but God submit, lay my reasonings at thy feet, and tell the Lord aboon 2-3 times that who never would submit to mon, or lay aught as who had at his feet. Gideon walked home with her and says, Rachel, thou seems very fond of that hymn about not submitting to mon. Yea, who says, it's a Graylian, and it's 4 lines 7s and all, and it goes well to Clayton Heights, a tune my mother used to sing when I were a little un. I want no one to know about 4 lines 7s nor Clayton Heights neither, says Gideon. It's the sentiment at them I'm talking about. Thou fair seems savage when thou sings that 3rd line. Not to man, but God submit. Has a man wronged thee at some time or summat? But Rachel said naught. Then Gideon plucked up and telled her who'd no right to judge all men by one, and that he knew of a mon that were a mon, and knew a woman when he sees one, and knew how to treat her and all. And at that mon were hissel, and who were the woman he loved. Then who telled him what who'd tell th' old superintender, that who were the Lord's spouse, and that her heart were up aboon. But, says Gideon, thy hymn says as thou submit to God, doesn't it? Yea, who says it does. Well, supposing God tell thee thou were to submit to mon, what then? I should like to do it, who says. There's no stunning again Providence. And Rachel telled us how there were a little braid as kept singing o'er their heads and saying to her, Do it, do it, do it. After a bit, Gideon said, Rachel, the Lord sent a message. He says that to be my wife. Does he, for sure? Who asked, looking down at the grass who were treading on. Yea, he does, and thou says thou submit to him. Rachel telled us how the little brid kept saying, Do it, do it, do it, and said as how who daren't but tak it as the voice of Providence. So when Gideon asked her again if who'd submit to God, who wept and said who'd be like to. Then, oud man as he were, he caught her in his arms and kissed her, and telled her how he'd love her both for time and eternity. Rachel telled him at the class meeting, as who couldn't have believed as love would have made the world so breatsome as it did that night. Who said as how the dying sunlight flashed more colours nor who'd ever seen afore, and how the little stars fair glinted at her with joy. Who'd heard the wind among the trees mony a time, but this night it sounded like the beating of the angels' wings, as who said it were heaven begun below. Poor lass, it were a new world to her, and who'd waited long enough for it, but like a deal else it come at last. Who'd often sung, as I've told you, that who'd never submit to mon, but who were fain to when mon come. Dash it, it's nature. What woman had lived about being wed if who'd a chance? converted or unconverted, I don't care which. It's nature, and you can't stand again it. Grace or no grace, it makes no matter." "And did they marry?" I asked. "Did they marry?" he replied in a tone of suppressed scorn, as though he pitied my lack of insight to read the sequel. "For sure he married. As Gideon said, they'd no time to lose. When a chap gets to 60 years and the lassie's na but 10 years younger, they both on 'em well on into th' afternoon of life. It were a wedding and all, I can tell you. They raised the flag at the factory, for Rachel were an oud weaver, and the chapel were as thronged as it were at the charity sermons, when Gideon and Rachel upset collecting plate between 'em. And th' oud superintendent married 'em and all. And when they were signing book in vestry, he looked at Rachel with a twinkle in his ear and said, 4 line 7s. "What did he mean by that?" I asked. "Why, he meant to ask Rachel if who were ready to sing th' oud hymn about not submitting to mon. But Rachel were no an old face with him, and told him how it were, because who'd submitted to God, that who'd submitted to Gideon. For, says who to the superintendent, it were the Lord's will as Gideon wed me, and woe to them as strives with their Maker." As I left the old man and walked across the fields that led from the factory to the moors, I overtook Rachel, walking in all the dignity of the calm assurance which health and religion confer. Greeting her, I told her of the story I had just heard from the old engineer, and thus recalled to her the scenes of former years. "It were in these meadows," she said, "where we're walking now, as Gideon first tell me what the Lord's will were concerning him and me. I took the Lord at his word, and Gideon and all, and I've never sorrowed o'er it. Gideon's in glory now, and when the time comes I shall join him. But he's no one left me but a bit of brass, praise the Lord. I submitted to his will, and he rewarded me according to my obedience. £1 a week is no one parish pay. No, the Lord's mindful of his own, their bread and their waters sure." And the old woman left me singing some religious ditty, in which the refrain of the verse was, "The Lord will provide."